be seated. Proceedings are resumed. The member from Red Bay continuing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we took the evening break, I had just concluded a rather lengthy and somewhat technical article from The Economist entitled Three Threats to the Global Economic Recovery Between a Rock and a Hard Place: Tightening American Monetary Policy, Slowing China, and the Omicron Variant being the three threats. And Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the point of reading that and referring it to the government, in particular the minister, the Premier and the Minister of Finance, for their consideration, is that article and an increasing number of other articles being written by economists point to a significant slowdown, if not worse, of the global economy. We know very well, Mr. Speaker, that whatever happens, particularly in the United States, is going to have a knock-on effect here. The Honorable Leader of the Opposition in his presentation spoke to the significant increase in inflation to 6.2% just published in relation to the United States. And thus, the budget that has been presented, we believe, places Cayman's government finances and the broader economy at real risk. When you consider that during our 8 years in office, we reduced national debt from $560 million in 2013 to under $250 million when we demitted office, a reduction of over $300 million, or more than 55%. And in one fell swoop, this government is proposing to increase the national debt to more than $400 million. Mr. Speaker, this borrow and spend approach to government finances is not a financial strategy. It is one that hopes, at best hopes, that government, without doing anything otherwise, is going to have the benefit of year-on-year increases in government revenue, which in the current global environment seems highly unlikely, not just because of the global conditions, but because of the clear indications the government continues to give that it intends to slow development and that it intends to make it more difficult for things like work permits to be gotten. Mr. Speaker, as I said before, government will only be able to support the broad socialist policies which they are articulating if it has the means to do so. And the current approach is not likely to give government those means. Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House have heard, and that's not just over the course of the last two terms. The concerns Caymanians express, the resentment Caymanians have of not getting what most consider a fair share of the economic pie and fair share of the opportunities. Mr. Speaker, this opposition, which was government for 2 terms, understands that well and did our best in the time we had to try to level the playing field by a number of measures we put in place, many of which were rehearsed in this House during the debate of various ministers and indeed some of the parliamentary secretaries. So, Mr. Speaker, we don't generally have or take issue with much that the government is proposing in terms of programs and projects. Our fundamental concern with this budget is how the government is proposing to fund it. And the government's obvious or apparent, wrong word, apparent lack of concern about how it is going to continue to generate the revenue over time to fund this and other budgets. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the member for Georgetown North, addressed the misleading statement in the Premier's speech about waiver of local company control law or act waivers. So I'm not going to go into that. But there's also an equally misleading statement about concessions, because the government's case is that by virtue of a range of these various measures which they attribute to our administration, and by the way, the Premier was Minister of Commerce and Minister for Financial Services in one of those administrations, so he should know better than to say some of the things he said. I guess somebody else wrote that and he had to say it. But, Mr. Speaker, in relation to concessions, when we took office in 2013, the unemployment rate for Caymanians was at 10.5%. We had delegations, I had delegations of people from various industries coming to me and to the Minister of Finance at the time, Mr. Marco Archer, and some even made presentations to the caucus, begging us to do something to get development moving, because businesses were failing, people were unemployed. Mr. Speaker, it was on the basis of that our government took a policy decision to offer concessions to developers, to encourage them, to incentivize them to get on with developments then, not years down the road. Many of these things, these major projects, take years to complete. But absent those concessions, many of those projects would never have gotten started. And so, when one takes policies of the government out of the context in which those policies were developed and implemented, you get misleading statements such as those which the Premier read from his speech. And you give people, perhaps that's what it was intended, you give people the impression that somehow the progressive-led administrations of the last 8 years were all about helping out developers. Yeah, we helped out developers because they were employing Caymanians, they were buying goods and services in Cayman, they were stimulating the local economy. Look at the last administration of ours and see how many concessions we granted then. The few that you will see there were continuations of earlier ones where projects weren't completed. It was a deliberate strategy, an economic tool we used, one of the few Cayman has, to stimulate development, to stimulate economic activity. Mr. Speaker, I am fearful that the approach this government is taking is going to see us with increased unemployment, failing businesses. The vicious cycle is going to set in, where government revenue continues to reduce, and government's ability to help those who most need it, when they most need it, is going to be impaired. Because there is no financial strategy to ensure, at least not articulated in this House, to ensure that Cayman continues the growth of our economy. Listen to those who tell you, oh, we don't need any more economic growth. Listen to them here and see where we wind up. Mr. Speaker, as you have said many times in the years that I've been in this House, we either embrace wealth or we will reap poverty. I don't know how many on the other side are old enough to know when being in Cayman and being a Caymanian meant you were poor for most people, but I'm old enough to know. I am old enough to know. Many people think this just come here so. I know, I remember well when 3 or 4 families were the ones who had anything at all to speak of. And where my people come out from, in East End and Bordentown, most of them had nothing. Mr. Speaker, I honestly, did not hear very much articulated here in terms of policies and programs or even projects, which I would not be able in appropriate circumstances to support. In fact, Mr. Speaker, sometimes when I close my eyes, except for the change in voice, it sounded like members on the other side were reading from some of the speeches that we made in this House over the last 8 years in relation to policies and programs. Mr. Speaker, seriously, Mr. Speaker, in 7 months, they developed all of that. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister of Finance, in his opening, was, I think, quite honest. He said, we build on foundations we did not lay. We warm ourselves on fires we did not light. We sit in the shade of trees we did not plant. We drink from wells we did not dig. And we profit from persons we did not know. Mr. Speaker, I translated that as we embrace policies we did not consider. We adopt programs we did not develop. We claim projects we did not conceive. And we fund them all with money we did not raise. You didn't know I was a poet. I was a poet and you didn't know it. But, Mr. Speaker, that is not a bad thing, even though it was a bit audacious. I think the one most guilty of that particular sin was the Minister Ebanks, who's been elected for 5 minutes, and he was schooling all of us on all of these projects that he had developed, and he was presenting on behalf of the government. Not even his people in Northside can believe that. Not in 7 months. But, Mr. Speaker, if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then I feel we on this side should consider ourselves very flattered, because much, I'd say as much as 80% of what I heard presented is the continuation of projects and policies and programs which we put in place. That is good for the country, because none of us who are ministers, very few of us, come with the background or skill to develop these policies. We've got to listen to what advisors tell us and use our political judgment on how to take them forward. That's how the business of government all over the world works. So, unlike the early days of this administration's tenure, when everybody was nervous because you were hearing they were going to stop this and they were going to stop the next thing, I feel a lot happier and a lot more relieved about the way forward in terms of the various policies and programs and projects. But, Mr. Speaker, our concern is not about that. Our concern is about what appears to be an unwillingness to trim the budget, to trim the projects, the cost of the projects and the programs and policies, to fit with what money is available and is likely going to be available over the course of the next 2 years and beyond. Because recurrent costs are just that. Every year, you've got to fund those. And to borrow, Mr. Speaker, the massive sum of almost $350 million for capital projects is, as the Leader of the Opposition said, a clear indication that there was no fiscal discipline employed in determining what priorities the government would take forward in the changed and uncertain circumstances in which the world and Cayman find themselves. And what is going to happen, Mr. Speaker, when this budget is over, this budget term is over, 2 years is over, and the government is still finds itself with a deficit? Can borrow again? Because, Mr. Speaker, I don't see anything in here that indicates the government intends to grow the economy. What I see here, and the measures I hear proposed, and the rhetoric, all of us here, business people here, is that we need to slow things down. Mr. Speaker, I had hoped that the Minister for Financial Services would have spoken before I rose. Maybe he'll speak, I hope he'll speak after I sit down. Because I think we can be satisfied, Mr. Speaker, that it's going to be at least another year before our tourism industry approaches anything near what we've been used to for all of these years. Financial services, thus, is going to be required to take an even greater role than it has all of these years in terms of generating government revenue. Now, Mr. Speaker, I did hear what the Parliamentary Secretary, Mrs. Ebanks-Wilkes, said, but she did not, at least I didn't hear her, address the risks around the industry. I know a fair bit about them. Spent many years dealing with those. And I do hope that the Minister will tell us where we are, what the challenges currently are, and hopefully that things are under control and there is nothing looming that is likely to do us great harm. I am not going to speculate about any of those things. I'm simply asking the Minister to tell us, because it's been silence since we demitted office, talked to people in the financial services industry as well, and the reports I have is that they're not hearing very much in terms of what's going on from government. Listen, I have a job here, and your mouth not gonna frighten me. You know, so I can defend myself. I hope you understand that. Mr. Speaker, in the time I have left, I want to ask, Mr. Speaker, that the government address two matters. Regen, Mr. Speaker, it took us almost 8 years to get the contract to where it was, to get the agreements signed. Mr. Speaker, this government has said it's committed to dealing with climate change, reducing our carbon footprint, doing things that make us ecologically much better. I believe them. In particular, I believe the Premier. But no single project in Cayman is more important than addressing the issue of solid waste management. We are all seeing worrying signs that because of measures not being employed, we are starting to see little fires or little smoke coming from the landfill again over the course of the last month. That's just how it began when we wound up with that massive fire that raged on for weeks. Mr. Speaker, there are few things the government needs to deal with that are more important than pushing that project forward before the space that is left available is all utilized and there is nowhere left to put solid waste. That project needs to be pushed ahead. Mr. Speaker, another matter which is creating much concern is the issue of the Legal Services Act, which though passed now 8-9 months ago, is still not in effect. That was considered a critically important piece of legislation years ago. The Premier himself attempted to bring 2 versions of that bill to this House, and it failed both times. When he was a minister in my government, I brought it with the support of the Attorney General, and we passed it. We did what I don't know how many governments had tried to do and couldn't get done. But it's no good passing it and it not being in effect. It's not addressing, when it's not in effect, it's not addressing the concerns that the international community, the OECD, the EU, and the whole range of them have concerns about the lack of proper, proper, what's the word I'm looking for? You gotta be careful with these lawyers. Regulation of the business of legal services, and particularly lawyers. It's not addressing the many concerns which wound up killing the bill on previous occasions that Caymanians had about their place and opportunities in the legal profession. Nothing is being addressed while it is sitting there in limbo. And the government has now been in office for 7 months. I passed it. No, we couldn't bring it into effect because there were committees that had to be formed. And the elections came more swiftly than any of us expected they would be. There would be. Otherwise, we might have gotten it done in time. But blame me all you wish. But it's your watch now. And any consequences which flow, adverse consequences which flow from the legislation not being in effect, will be laid at your feet, not mine. Mr. Speaker, I ask on behalf of my colleagues on this side that the government think again about this budget, about the massive borrowing that they're undertaking, that they think again about the rhetoric that they continue with aimed at discouraging more development, economic development I'm speaking about, not necessarily physical, economic development. Mr. Speaker, that the government address whatever is causing the problems with work permits being processed. Mr. Speaker, if the policy is to turn down the work permits, then do so. But do not leave people in limbo for months because the matters are not being considered. Because I can tell the government now that there is already talk of seeking judicial review of the fact that decisions aren't being made. These things have massive economic consequences for businesses when they can't get staff. And Mr. Speaker, we are not going to rebuild this economy. We are not going to rebuild tourism. We are not going to increase government revenue by stopping businesses from getting workers that they need. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your patience. I am grateful for the opportunity to have made a few observations about the government budget. Thank you, sir.
Premier? Premier? You? Honorable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have had a long day, and I think we would propose, and I would move the suspension of this Honourable House until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Sorry, adjournment of this Honourable House, not suspension. Adjournment of this Honourable House until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, and we will come back and take things further. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Question is that this Honourable Parliament do now adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. This Honourable Parliament stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.